Hey folks, welcome to week 3 of DMD 320 application and mobile design. All right, what are we doing this week? All right, let's take a look. We'll go down to module 3, week 3 here, and take a look around. Okay, so in week 3, we are actually going to slow things down a bit because week 1 and 2, we covered a lot of material. We covered all this stuff in week 2, all these different things we needed, as well as, of course, the introduction in week 1. And last week, the big thing we introduced, of course, was Xcode and your Xcode exercises that you're going to be working on throughout the semester at your own pace. So this week I wanted to not give you guys not a lot to do, so you could spend a lot of time this week playing around with Xcode, getting to know the lessons, and really practicing with it. So let's take a look at the week 3 overview and see what we're doing. Okay, so the first goal of week 3 here is just to review some of the basics from DMD 120, the UX and UI class that you guys already took. So we're going to take a look at the UX workflow, that handout, what is usability testing, and wireframe mockups. Now, the good news about this is that if you remember all this stuff and you're really good at usability testing and making your wireframe mockups because you've done it in DMD 120 and maybe you did it in DMD 220 as well, then you can skip over this part. And so then you can really spend the majority of your week focusing on practicing with the lessons in Xcode. Okay, so we're going to go through all that in a second. Also this week, there's some things to consume, some things to digest. We have 2 things right here. There is what is user experience testing for good practices. This is a great article. Again, if you want to expand your knowledge of usability testing, read through this article. It's incredibly short. There's a lot of really great tips and tricks in there. And then the other thing here is this video, which has nothing to do with usability testing. It is just sort of a philosophical view on things of technology in society today, how smartphones change the way you think. Definitely check that out, and we will talk about it later, okay? Things that were due this week, make sure that you have already downloaded Xcode on to your Mac, assuming you have a Mac. And of course, you can access Xcode in either of the Mac labs on campus. So that'll give you a place to practice with it if you yourself do not have a Mac. That'll work out just fine. And we'll get more into that in a little bit. And of course, we will continue with the usability stuff. Let's take a quick look. Okay, so the 2 handouts up here that are reviews of DMD 120 are these here. We'll get back to Xcode in a second. What is usability testing? We use this in DMD 120. So again, it goes through the idea of why we do usability testing, who the users are, they're of course humans, and why this research is super important for developing websites, mobile sites, apps, or pretty much anything like that. So we again use this in DMD 120. It's a really short handout, and make sure you are familiar with it, okay? And then next we get into examples of wireframe mockups to inspire your mobile development, right? So here's some examples. This handout's slightly updated for this class that focuses more on mobile. So here are some really loose pencil wireframes for a mobile design. So you can see that they can be really sketchy and really loose. And then, of course, you've seen these other examples that are done on dot paper or graph paper to give you an idea of what your wireframe should look like. Now, reminder, in this class, I am not checking your wireframes and user testing. That is completely up to you to get that done so that your finished products work as well as they could. So in DMD 120, we did it sort of together and we checked your progress. In DMD 220, if you've already taken that class, again, it's mandatory and we go over them in class. But here in this class, it is the honor system that you will be doing wireframes for your project as well as usability testing. Now, I shouldn't say honor system for wireframes. Those actually show up in our final deliverable, as I showed you in the example. So you do have to show me your wireframes, but the usability testing is entirely up to you. I strongly suggest you do that because it'll certainly show in your finished product. Okay, so outside of those, reviewing those 2 things, like I said, if you're already really familiar with them and you know what you're doing with usability testing and wireframes, then you don't have too much to do on that front. So the remainder of this week should be used in Exploring Xcode. So this is the handout you got last week, right? All about Xcode. Make sure that you have read through it. I know we went over it together, but read through it again. Make sure you're familiar with all of it. Make sure you have downloaded Xcode onto your computer if you have your own Mac. Easy enough to download. Once it's downloaded and installed, this is what it looks like. This is the software. Similar to Code Academy that we worked with in DMD 120. It's a similar sort of setup in that you have files on the left, you have your coding column next, and then over here you have an automatic preview of what it is you are building in code. So whatever you write in code will visually present itself over here so you can see whether or not you've gotten it right. Now, Xcode is a little more complicated than what we were doing in Code Academy with HTML and CSS. But that being said, again, this is a self-paced set of exercises that once you get to that point in the handout. Let's get back over there. So you download Xcode. You can also access Xcode in the Mac Labs. And then we sort of talk about these tutorials, right? So you can start out with these two basic tutorials. This is a super beginner's tutorial. It's only 41 minutes long, really simple. And then Apple has some documentation that you can download on Xcode, which I'll show you right here, which comes in handy too. This gives you a really quick overview of how Xcode works. So between those two sources, that 41-minute video and this, that'll give you the absolute basics on Xcode. Then next in the handout, we're going to make our way down while we talk about why we're using Xcode and what the requirements are for class. But we covered that last week. So this week, you should really be getting in, now that you've got the software downloaded and you're ready to rock and roll, you should be getting into these 12 chapters by Chris Ching here, these Xcode tutorials for beginners. Remember, there's 12 chapters. The goal here is for you not to become an expert. I don't even care if you get through all 12 chapters. The goal is to get through as many as you can in the semester and become as familiar with Xcode as possible. Remember, we're not trying to become coders here. You should just be familiar with it so that if you are doing front-end design work for mobile apps or mobile sites or even games or things for the Apple Watch or even Mac OS applications, because Xcode helps you build all of those things, it is important to understand how the coding works and be familiar with it so you can work with coders on the things that you are designing and make sure that you are designing things that can actually be built based on the way the code works. So again, it's the same premise I've been telling you guys for a few classes. In the world of print design, you should understand how offset printing works, not because you're going to be a printer, but because you need to be able to design things that printers can actually make reasonably. Same thing with coding. Whether it be HTML, CSS, JavaScript, or something else, or in this case, Xcode and Swift for making iOS and macOS products, it's helpful to know how these work. So there's 12 lessons. Let's go over to the website. And you can see here it starts out pretty simple. He gives you just a little preamble, and then there's the 12 lessons. There's actually a 13th one, which is just the conclusion, but don't worry about that one too much. Most of this stuff you've kind of done. So the first one is what is Xcode, right? Just goes over that. Second one is download Xcode and install it. Well, you should have that done already. So really, you can jump into number 3 if you would like. And just to show you how they're set up, I'm actually going to go into the first one. It gives you quick little paragraphs. Notice how large the type is. It's real simple. And he walks you through screen by screen what to do. And then every once in a while, he'll drop in a YouTube video which goes over it in video format. So if you don't want to read through everything and do it as it's described, if you'd rather listen to and watch his video, you can do that too. It's super helpful. It works both ways. And they're chaptered. So we have chapter 2, download and install Xcode, right? Like I said, you should have that done already. It talks about Xcode alternatives, right? But we're not really dealing with that, but it's good to be familiar with it. And then how to use Xcode, chapter 3. And then again, it jumps in here with a video. So there are 12 of these things. Take your time. This week, since there's really not a lot to do this week, because you should be pretty familiar with usability testing and wireframing, you can spend 90% of this week starting to work on your Xcode tutorials, okay? So take your time with it. Do not put a lot of pressure on yourself. I just want you to become familiar with it, okay? So no freaking out. Now, As I mentioned in the handout, some of you might completely fall in love with Xcode and be like, you know what? I love coding. I love coding with Swift. And if you're that kind of person and you're really zipping along learning the coding and you love it, there is extra credit to be had for this assignment. You can not only earn your 20% towards your grade by just doing the 12 mandatory lessons, but down here there are 3 links to more advanced lessons. So if you really want to keep going with it, I am not going to stop you. It's good stuff to have. But if not, if you are not great with coding and you're struggling with it and you just want to become familiar with it and get your 20% for the class, then just get through the lessons at whatever pace that you can handle, okay? All right, so that is it for this week. Like I said, not a lot to do, so I want you to really spend time working with Xcode and working with Chris Ching's tutorials here, okay? All right, you guys have a good week, and happy coding. I will talk to you soon.